I finished knitting my swatch for the demo of section 1, and I cut the yarn when I finished that last row, and I transferred the stitches to a double pointed needle. I was using a circular needle first. Also, I marked the center stitch at the top and at the bottom of my work. And the bottom of my work is actually a provisional cast on that I started with. And in this swatch, I started with seven stitches, and I finished with 7 stitches. To begin the I-cord bind off, I'm going to rotate my work, and I'm going to transfer the stitches here. I want to remove the provisional cast on and transfer the stitches to another double pointed needle. But if you'll notice in here, my marker is actually spanning 2 stitches. And that's normal because we changed the direction of the work. But I do still have to recover 7 stitches. On the right side, I have this tail, and half stitch is trapped within this cast on. On the left, I have this loop in here trapping another half a stitch, but this half a stitch on the left appears to be about 1 row lower than this row up here. So if I count my stitches, I will count half a stitch in here, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and half a stitch in here. So I have 7. So the choice is I can either pick up this half stitch on the left or take this tail yarn and make 1 stitch out of it. And to me, that appears to be the better option, to take this tail yarn and make a stitch out of it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring my yarn to the front, take a crochet hook, go under this loop in here, and going to, from the back, insert that crochet hook and pull the yarn through to the back. With that done, now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stitches. In this scenario, then the center stitch is now this stitch here. So I'm going to transfer this marker to the stitch in here, and that becomes my center stitch. Next, I'm going to remove this crochet cast on. I'm just going to unravel it. And you'll notice that because I looped that stitch to the back, I'm just going to pull it out, just like that. Put that first stitch on my double pointed needle, continue unraveling, and carefully I'm going to recover this next stitch. And I can actually insert my double pointed needle through that stitch first and then pull the yarn out. This way I don't lose that stitch, it doesn't unravel. And I continue this process until I pick up 7 stitches. And this is the last one. So I have 2, 4, 6, 7. Then I'll just pull the waste yarn out, and now I have 7 stitches that I pulled from the cast on edge, and then 7 stitches from working that last row. To work the I-cord bind off, for this particular pattern, my recommendation is that to start picking up stitches on one of the sides. Now it doesn't matter whether, obviously which side, which side is the top, which side is the bottom. They should be identical. So just pick a side. In this case, I'm just going to go with this, like this. And I am going to start picking up stitches from the right side. And I'm going to go this way to this point, picking up stitches. Then I'm going to knit these stitches, pick up stitches all the way down, knit these stitches, and then pick up stitches to this point. But when we work the icord bind off, we will start by casting on 4 stitches. And then when we get to this point in here, we're going to graft the cast on, the cast on edge with the last row of the icord. So basically what's going to happen when we're picking up stitches from this end, we are going to leave a space where we are not going to pick up any stitches. And that space is of 1 row. So we're going to leave one space of 1 row between the first stitch we pick up and the last stitch we pick up. Because when we graft the cast on edge to the last row, we're going to gain 1 row. And that information is all outlined in your pattern. Also in your pattern, there is a guide in terms of how many stitches to pick up in each area. Next, we need to pick up stitches, and we also want to make sure that when we start knitting, we need to be starting to knit with the ball yarn, of course. To do that, we have 2 options. One is we turn the work to the wrong side and we start picking stitches where we pick up and purl. But that's not something that I like to do. I like to have the work in front of me so I know where the stitches are picked up. I only pick up on the wrong side when I must. But because we need the ball yarn at the beginning, because then we will cast on some additional stitches and begin working the icord, it means that if we are going to pick up stitches on the right side, then we need to pick it up with the tail yarn. And to do that, we're going to have a tail about 4 times the circumference of the circle. Now this technique will work with any shape. If you have a rectangle, a square, a triangle, it's the same exact thing. Basically, you want to measure the outside border of the shape that you have. With the circle, we're going to measure the circumference. So this is the circumference of approximately the circumference of the circle. I'm going to take 4 times that distance. And you should have plenty of tail available if you do 4 times the distance. So that's 4 times. I did it 4. And so this is where basically this is the tail that I will be picking up stitches with. And I'm going to start at this point, like here. I'm going to take my circular needle and I am going to start about 1 row above the center of the work. It doesn't have to be exact, approximately. Then I'm going to pick up. So notice here, I almost started picking up with the ball yarn, which is not what we need to do. So pick up that first stitch, and again, approximately half the distance. And then I'm going to continue picking up stitches with the tail yarn. I mean, if you're a continental knitter, you could just hold the yarn in your left hand and pick up the stitches. And of course, if you are a traditional English knitter, you'll hold the yarn with your right hand. And then I'm going to, as I said, you have guidelines in your pattern, a guide to tell you how many stitches you need to pick up where. So here, I believe I have enough stitches picked up. Then when I get to the stitches on the double pointed needle, I will just simply knit these stitches. Now, because you have a guide, it may make sense to put markers after each section that you pick up stitches from. So now this is done. I don't need it anymore. And then I will continue to pick up stitches from the edge until I have picked up stitches around the entire circle. I finished picking up stitches around the circle, and here's my ball yarn, and it's attached to the first stitch. And here is my tail yarn. I have a little bit left over attached to my last stitch. And if you'll notice in here, I have one row, space of one row between the first and last stitches. And also I've went back and I put markers between the various different sections of the circle, and that helped me pick up the number of stitches needed for each section. Now I am going to set up to start working the icord bind off. And the icord bind off is actually a 4-stitch icord that we're going to start by doing a backward loop cast on method. There are different ways of doing the backward loop cast on method. The way I'm going to show you today is the one I prefer to use because I want to keep the work to my the right side of the work facing me, and I'm holding the left needle in my left hand, and I'm going to take the side of the yarn that's connected to the ball. I'm going to twist it in such a way where I am actually bringing the yarn, the side that's connected to the ball, to the front, and I'm gonna twist it again to put it on the needle. To repeat the process, I twist to bring the tail connected to the ball to the front. I twist again to put onto the needle. And I'm going to repeat this 2 more times to cast on 4 stitches. When I work this cast on, first stitch and the second stitch, just want to show you that what happens is I've got this X at the bottom of each stitch. Got an X in here and an X in here. And this is important because we are going to use the loops of the X to graft, to use it as a location for grafting the last row of the icord with the cast on. But when I work to the last stitch for the icord bind off, I'm going to take that last stitch, which means it's that first stitch that I put on the needle, and I'm going to work it through the back loop with the stitch that I picked up off of the circle. when I knit those together, you'll notice in here I've got these nice X's on the first 3 stitches, but when I look at the stitch in here, because I knitted it through the back loop, I don't have as nice of an X, and when I try to graft this stitch, it's going to leave a gap, which I'm not going to be happy with. And the reason I know this is because I've tried it about 10 times. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you a way to fix this. So I'm going to unravel, put the stitch back onto the needle, and so the problem I have is with that first stitch I put on the needle. And that's because of the rotation. I'm rotating it clockwise like this and putting it on the needle. And so when I knit it through the back loop, it's reversing the order of the legs of that stitch, and that's creating a problem for me when I graft. What I'm going to do alternatively is I'm actually going to take I'm going to rotate it in the other direction. So instead of twisting to the front, I'm going to twist to the back. And so you see how that yarn now connected to the ball is behind this yarn connected to the needle. And I'm going to twist again and put onto the needle and pull on it to tighten. So now when I knit this loop, when I knit these 2 stitches through the back loop, it's going to maintain the order of the legs of the stitch. So let me show you again. So I'm going to twist the yarn in my hand so that the side that's connected to the ball is behind the strand connected to the needle. And I'm going to twist it again slightly to put it on the needle. And I'm going to pull the tail yarn to tighten. So that will be my first stitch. The 3 other stitches were no problem. So I'm just going to twist to the front and put them on the needle. You may ask, why don't we just twist to the back all of the stitches? Why do we only do it for the first stitch? And that would be a great question. The reason that we don't twist it to the back and for the other 3 stitches is because when we twist it to the back like this and we knit that stitch, I will show you here, it actually introduces a double twist to the bottom. And it's kind of hard to see in here with this stitch worked. Actually, let me show you the second stitch. I did 2 of those and I'm going to knit them. And what happens is that you actually introduce double twists to the bottom of that stitch right here. It's twice twisted, and that creates big problems for us when we try to graft that cast on edge with the last row. So we're going to twist to the back for the first stitch, then we're going to twist to the front for the next 3 stitches, put them on the needle, and at this moment we're ready to begin working the I-cord bind off, and we do that by knitting 3 stitches, and then that 4th stitch we knit it through the back loop with the first stitch that we picked up on the circle. And let me actually and then we transfer all of these stitches back to the left needle to work the next row of the I-cord. And let me finish this and show you the bottom. So again, we knit 3, we knit 2 through the back loop, and I want to show you now. I'm going to transfer those first though. I'm going to show you the nice cast on edge. So here I have a nice X on every stitch. So I've got this stitch that goes down this way, and I've got this leg and this leg, and they form a nice X. And then I've got this next stitch, I've got this leg and this leg here, they form a nice X. And then I'll walk down to the third stitch, this leg and this leg of that stitch form a nice X. And then the last one, same thing, we've got the two legs, even though they're twisted the other direction, that's not going to be a problem for us, but I have nice clean legs that are forming an X, which I'm going to use to graft. I am back again. I finished working the icord around the circle, and I transferred the last 4 stitches onto a cable needle, short cable needle, or you can use a double pointed needle, because it's going to be a lot easier to handle than the circular needle with the cable on it. And I still have the yarn attached to the ball, so I haven't cut the yarn yet. And I have my tail yarn. For this graft, I'm actually going to use the tail yarn to graft with versus the ball yarn, because that's going to allow me to modify the tension on this stitch, or even on this whole entire row, a lot easier. So I'm going to take the tail yarn and thread it through a tapestry needle. And you remember we left a row that's empty where we didn't pick up any stitches. Going to go from under and bring the tail yarn through that row. And by the way, I didn't cut the yarn because I didn't want to confuse which yarn I want to work with. So I kept it connected to the ball, and so I can easily identify my tail yarn. Okay, so then, as if I am working in icord row, I'm going to knit this first stitch. And to do this, I'm going to go into that stitch from under it, like that. And they call this as if to purl, but I'm just going to use under or from the top. So under that stitch, pull that yarn through, and then I'm going to rotate the work until I can identify that first column of stitches, which is my first stitch. I'm going to come all the way to the bottom, and I'm going to identify that X. So I'm going to go through and insert my needle at the bottom of the X, so you can see the X from the bottom a lot easier than you can see it from the top. And then I'm going to pull that needle through it, through that X. And then I'm going to go to my first stitch in here, and I'm going to go from the top into it and release that off the needle. Then I'm going to repeat the process where I'm going into that stitch from this next stitch from the bottom. I'm going to leave that on the needle. Then I'm going to identify the next column of stitches, which is the second stitch. And then I'm going to identify that X on the bottom. See, that's the X of that second stitch. You can see it clearly from the bottom. and I'm going to pull my needle through it, just like that. And then I'm going to go into the stitch onto the that's on that cable needle from the top and remove it off the needle, and go into the next stitch from the bottom and keep it on the needle. And by the way, this row that we're grafting, don't worry about tension right now. We'll adjust it later when we're finished. And then again, we'll go to the next column of stitches, which is the third stitch. We go all the way to the bottom. I identify that X on the bottom. See that X right here of that third stitch. We'll pull that needle through that X. And then come into the top, through that stitch on the bottom, through the top, release it off the needle, and then onto the next stitch from the bottom, next stitch on the needle from the bottom, we keep on the needle, and then we go to the last stitch, the last column of stitches in the last stitch, and we identify that X. It's a bit right here, see that X in here. I think you should be able to see this X clearly. Pull that needle through that X, and then the last step is to bring that needle through the bottom stitch from the top and into it like this. So you notice that I have this stitch a bit loose, which is good, or so we can fix very easily by pulling on that ball yarn. And then we've got, this is our graft row, and you'll notice that it's a little bit loose, no problem. So we'll just pull on it to adjust the tension. And you can work with this stitch to make sure that you got the right tension. So I probably should pull it a little bit more. That first stitch is good. This probably can stand a little bit more. And this stitch a little bit more. Here we go. Then basically we can take this yarn through, the tail yarn through the end to the back, and here we go. We have grafted the cast on end to the last row of the icord. So I want to show you one last trick. So notice in here, this all of these stitches here are crossed, but the stitch that we grafted is not crossed. But we can do that if we want to. It's not a requirement, and in the bigger scheme of things, you won't notice it. But if it bothers you and you do want to notice it, I want to show you how to actually do this. So here is the graft. So I'm going to take it out. I'm going to undo it. And I'm going to undo the other leg that's going into the X. However, I'm going to keep it in the bottom stitch. I'm not going to undo that end. So I'm going to leave it there. Rethread the yarn through the needle, the tapestry needle. So when we did it the first time, we went through from the front leg, or from the right to the left, and then we brought in the needle, the yarns through the stitch to the bottom, and that gave us a normal stitch, not being crossed like these stitches right here. To come up to get a crossed stitch, So instead of going from right to left, we go from left to right into that final X. We pull this through like this, and then we take this needle and we go into that stitch from the top like this. And here we go. This is the stitch. It's crossed like every other stitch in there.